Next speaker, Nina Teicholz. She is a renowned science journalist, and she's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Big Fat Surprise, which upended the conventional wisdom on dietary fat, especially saturated fat. And it spurred this new conversation about whether these fats in fact cause heart disease. Nina is also the founder of the Nutrition Coalition, and the Nutrition Coalition is a nonprofit working to ensure that nutrition policies are transparent and evidence-based. She's even testified before the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we really need food advocates like Nina, out there battling government policy, don't we? And Teicholz, she's a graduate of Stanford and Oxford, and previously served as an associate director of the Center for Globalization and Sustainable Development at Columbia. She's a native New Yorker. She's our Manhattanite, Manhattan in the house. Please welcome Nina Teicholz.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. And thank you to Christina for putting together this conference. It's a very brave thing to do in New York City to have a conference on keto. I live here, not too far away. And I can tell you what the vibe is like in New York City. I went to a party at a very fancy house, and the hostess, this is the wife of a TV personality, and she says well, I've decided just to have a vegan dinner because I figure that's sort of the compromise that everybody can agree upon. And I'm thinking okay, what's on this side of vegan? So that's sort of the environment you're in. It's you really, in polite company, you just don't order a steak, and so it's so here we are. So congratulations to all of you for showing up, coming from far away and here nearby. So I think it's great that I'm coming right after Dr. Tro, because he really talks about sort of the inner circle of things that affect you, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the outer circle of forces that affect the information that you're getting, the messages that you are consciously or unconsciously imbibing. And it is really a misinformation environment that we live in, right? That is the misinformation that vegan is the default diet now. And so I want to explore that a little bit with you so you can understand what are these, what is going on that is seeping into your mind and all the minds of the people around you. So just first, my disclosures, I did write this book, which is I still get royalties for. And just as a small, it's been a while since that came out, but it's interesting to see some of the information it's wonderful to see people talk about, and especially Cynthia talking about on vegetable oils. There are still great stories in here that why you don't want to eat vegetable oils in restaurants, what happens to the people frying the French fries in those restaurants, and how their uniforms would spontaneously combust on the way to the dry cleaners because they're so full of the toxic oxidation products that come off of those oils. So it's really, there is really an interesting backstory to why somebody now says we should not be eating seed oils, and raise your hand in a restaurant and say, I'd like that cooked in butter. But anyway, so that's my disclosures. Otherwise, I don't receive any industry support for my work. And the reason I have to say this will be revealed later in my talk. But I also, I want to add that, like Dr. Tro, I am biased for low carb. I came to it honestly. I was for 20 years a vegetarian, and it was only in the almost decade that I spent researching and writing this book and reading thousands and thousands of scientific studies that I realized, wow, what I really truly believed was not based on any rigorous information. So I now have a bias on the other side. But I really want to talk about how hard it is to live in a world where you are taking steps to make yourself healthier in every way, and yet you're surrounded by people telling you that the diet that you're eating is killing you, or what a weird diet. I still get this from my mom. She's well, that weird diet you're on, darling. I was do I look like I'm suffering right now? So So this is part of the, and this is just an example of the information environment, but I think it's a powerful one. It comes out, this is the best diets, comes out in US News. It's out every January 1st or first year, and it's always some version of the following. Mediterranean diet is always number 1 or 2. You might be tied with the American Heart Association diet. The Mediterranean diet, which I spent a long time researching, and turns out it's the product of a marketing campaign by the International Olive Oil Council in Europe, which hosted a series of conferences all over sun-kissed spots around the Mediterranean that all the researchers and food writers went to, and that they came up with the Mediterranean diet, which, by the way, was based on research on 30 to 33 people on the island of Crete, all men. And one of the periods in which they sampled them was during Lent. They went and looked at their diets. Nevertheless, there you are. The Mediterranean diet is number 1, and healthy eating. It's also, known. It's widely known as being mostly plants. That is completely not true. I don't know how many people have been to a country in the Mediterranean over the past few years. Anybody? I mean, what is on the menu? It's mainly meat, and there are little bits of pasta, and there's definitely plants, but it's not a meat-free diet. Well, this is a chart that was put together by Richard Feinstein, where he shows, well, what was the actual reduction? This is from the main study on the Mediterranean diet that was done in Spain, funded by food companies, by the way, which is not well known. And it came out on the front page of every newspaper when the results were announced, because it was a 5-year study, which is long, and it was supposed to reduce cardiovascular events. But when Richard Feynman looked at the absolute risk reduction, it was 0.02. So a tiny risk reduction in cardiovascular outcomes that included heart attack, stroke, or death from heart disease. So that is the basis from the largest study that ever was done on the Mediterranean diet. That's the evidence for it, a tiny, tiny improvement. Otherwise, more recently, there have been a number of other Mediterranean diet studies, of course, and this was a rigorous review of them, and they found that it performed slightly less well than a low-carbohydrate diet, but otherwise did not kick it out of the park on any outcomes. I mean, you see here a little bit in blood pressure and weight loss, but it didn't rank anywhere near the top on other cardiovascular outcomes or controlling blood sugar for diabetes. So not very impressive. And still, it's judged the number 1 diet by US News. And then there's all of these other diets. There's usually some version of diets like this that you may or may not have heard of. I mean, the Engine 2 diet, anybody? Those numbers refer to where it is on the list. So the Mayo Clinic diet is number 5. Autoimmune protocol is number 35 on the list. Usually the lower amounts of carbohydrates recommended, the lower it is on the list. Each of these diets I looked and there had only been 1 clinical trial for each of these. And in most cases, they're funded by the same people who are promoting them, so biased research. And that's the basis for those diets. What about the diets that we know about? Atkins was ranked 34 out of 39 diets. When I went on PubMed, which is where they list all the clinical trials, 693 clinical trials. That's a little more than 1, right? Keto and modified keto, which was ranked 37 out of 39, that should say. I don't really know what modified keto. It's like some other version that they made up. Over 1,000 clinical trials. So, I mean, that's an extraordinary amount. So clinical trials, as you may or may not know, is the most rigorous kind of research that you can do. So that's a very significant number there, far more than those other diets that ranked higher on the list. So I'm just sort of letting you know, like, this is the level of misinformation. By the way, whenever that US diets issue comes out, There's a bunch of us who go slightly crazy, like, how could they do this again? And we have, Gary Taubes and I wrote an op-ed in the LA Times. I wrote another op-ed for I can't remember where. We write about this. It's not that they don't know. Mark Cucuzella has actually been invited to be on their board, but that didn't make any difference. So, the short answer is that the people on that board are all plant-based people. And they're not letting that's their evaluation of the evidence, is that they have their beliefs. So here's another bit of misinformation, right? I don't care that low-carb diets improve your best way to control your blood sugar. It doesn't matter that it improves 22 out of 23 cardiovascular outcomes, or that it's the best diet for weight loss. It is still going to kill you. By what methods, we don't know. But there have been many studies coming out and showing this, apparently. So one of the things that we did to try to counter this misinformation was I was part of this paper in Nutrients. It's a pretty great group here that made the argument that the low carbohydrate diet was supported by enough evidence to be recommended officially as official policy. It's a pretty good compilation of all the evidence out there, if you ever want to take it to your doctor, for instance. What did we find? This was my little contribution here, but I went through all those studies on mortality and I looked at what did they consider a low carbohydrate diet. Well, this is what you can see here. It's, I'm not sure I'm going to get this button right, but anyway, 53% of calories is carbohydrates, 40%, 40.9. None of those is a low carbohydrate diet. So they're not, whatever their definition is, it's not what is even vaguely accepted as low carb. And that's where they're taking their numbers for mortality. So when somebody says the diet's going to kill you, you can say that's based on information that is not low carb. So there's also, there's ways in which the scientific community will distort results. And so we just looked at one that was they're giving the incorrect definition for low carb in order to find outcomes that are not really accurate. They can fail to publish negative outcomes. These are just sort of a list of things that are due. They can summarize studies in a way to exaggerate or distort results. There's withholding trial data and designing a study to get the desired results. And this is called, I love this term by Ben Goldacre, elegant mischief at the margins of acceptability. I wouldn't say some of this I don't think is quite at the margins. I'll just give you an example that many of you will probably know, but this was the largest study called the Minnesota Coronary Survey on the question of, does saturated fats and cholesterol cause heart disease? So this is the longest and largest study that ever occurred. It went on for 4.5 years, some 9,000 men and women, and they were in inpatient settings in Minnesota, so that their food was largely controlled. And it was funded by the National Institutes of Health. Half the people got 9% of calories as saturated fat. So these are the people getting the soy-filled milk and the soy burgers and the soy cheese and whatever. And then the other group had the amount of saturated fat that was considered standard at the time. This was in the 1960s. So what was considered standard is going to shock you. It was 18% of calories as saturated fat. 18% is like, out of the park, really. We're told that the Heart Association says you should have 6% or less if you're at risk of heart disease. So those are the people eating regular meat, dairy, cheese. And at the end of that study, they concluded there was no difference between the treatment and the control groups for any kind of outcome that they could find. And actually, when they went back and looked at the data, later, they found that the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the more likely they were to die from heart disease. But when these results came out in the 60s, what happened to this study is that they didn't publish them. Even though it was funded by National Institutes of Health, Ansel Keys, who knew Ansel Keys? Anybody? Yeah, he was one of the original project investigators on this study, didn't publish the results. Because, as Ivan France, one of the study leaders, said when he was interviewed by Gary Taubes, there was nothing wrong with the study, we were just so disappointed in the way it came out. So this is withholding scientific data, and it's one of the things that we see over and over again. I'm skipping that. So when you try to understand, well, what is happening to our science and our health data, you have to start looking at the larger forces that are at play here. So, and this has a kind of an academic term called the commercial determinants of health. But they are strategies and approaches used by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to your health. This happens. This is a real documented phenomenon, and this and there's many articles on it now. And I want to give you a kind of tragic, hilarious example of this, which is this is a chart of this is a food rating system. Many of you have seen this on Twitter probably already, but it's a food rating system developed to show what foods to eat. Green is go, eat those foods, and what foods to avoid. Red is avoid. This is a chart by a critic of this system who put this up there to show how ridiculous it is, right? So you've got frosted mini wheats, go, Honey Nut Cheerios, almond M&Ms, anything better than ground beef or cheddar cheese. Avoid the red, and this was put out by a very prominent nutrition scientist, whom I'll introduce in a second. And so in all, Cheerios not up here, but scores 95 points out of 100. One of the healthiest foods on the planet is Cheerios. Top ratings to Lucky Charms and Cocoa Puffs. And notice they're all named by brand, right? So there's over 70 cereals named by brand. If that is not an example of the private sector promoting themselves blatantly through nutrition science, I don't know what is. So that's the article that this is from, just to have some context. This is the author of the food rating system. And the reason that I put him up there is that he is now behind, he is, I would say now, today, the single most influential nutrition scientist in the United States. Wow. The guy who thinks Cheerios is the healthiest food on the planet. And this White House conference is happening this Wednesday. I wrote about it. But he's the dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition and Policy at Tufts University, and he's apparently, you heard it here, going to be the White House nutrition czar, which will soon be named soon. So soon, see Lucky Charms and Cocoa Puffs coming to a school near you. So I wrote about this, and this is a new column that I'm writing called Unsettled Science, and it's all about why we're not getting the news that we should about nutrition science and what is happening to health as a result. That's the fanciest thing that I can do on PowerPoint. So this is another article on basically the commercial determinants of health, but how does industry go about promoting their messages to you? And it's pretty interesting. I'm just going to highlight a little bit about it. One is they frame and they reframe the narrative about how you're supposed to think about food. And this is everything that Dr. Tro was just trying to talk about, how he's going to educate you from. But the messages out there are really clear. You know, it's your fault. You're a glutton, and you can't control your appetite. You look like this miserable granny. This is promoted by, and calories in, calories out. That was a whole corporate strategy that was put together by this International Life Sciences Institute, among others, and they're a group of mega multinational food companies, and they had something called the Global Energy Balance Network. Maybe you've read about that, but that was all designed to promote the calories in, calories out. And the reason that they love that so much is that it treats all calories coming in as the same, right? Your calories could be from Coke, they could be from broccoli, it's all the same to them. More, in moderation, let them eat sugar, don't deprive them. These are all corporate messages that, we've seen, but they're all products of their corporate communications and PR. here's an old one that I just think is extraordinary, like how brazen they are, that you, this idea that you need sugar to undereat is just the absolute opposite of what sugar actually does to your appetite. So there are, I mean, when you think the whole world is full of disinformation, how can we possibly find a grounding in what is really good science? And the answer is there are systems for reviewing the science. And these are some of them. We don't have to go into them. But there's systems for evaluating and reviewing science. For saying, like, this science is good science and rigorous, and this is not. Right? So, and it basically follows something called the pyramid of evidence, where randomized controlled trials are towards the top. Those are experiments where they give some people the diet or the drug or whatever, and then they have a control group. And so that's the only way you can really test any kind of intervention. And then there's observational studies, which are, this is associated with that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with why it's observational studies are relatively weak. Here's, you know, just one of the famous ones that I like to put up. The less margarine you eat, the less likely you are to get divorced. If your marriage is on the rocks, cut back on margarine. And here's another one. If you don't want to become autistic, don't eat organic food. So these are perfect correlations. There's a guy who's dedicated part of his life to just putting together these charts of ridiculous correlations, but they're not causation. One does not cause the other, right? Somebody just posted a great photograph of a roof that had caved in, and so there was like a kind of a V in the roof, and there was a cat sitting at the low point of the roof. It's a perfect example of correlation not being causation, right? Did that cat cause that roof to cave in? I don't think so. Where this really comes home for us is in all the studies that we see in the newspapers that our Uncle Bob sends to us and you're confronted with around the family table about associations, right? So the same way that margarine is not associated with your marital success, that's the same kind of study that has been used to show is eating meat associated with cancer, right? So this was the study that was used for the WHO decision to say that meat causes cancer. What was the problem with that? Well, when they're looking at meat eaters, they're also likely, or they're more likely to be overweight, to smoke, to use alcohol, and not to exercise. Any of those things could be causing the cancer. You don't know that it's the meat eating. There's something, and whereas non-meat eaters are people like this. They're following their doctor's orders, they're slimmer, they're doing everything right because their doctors are telling them not to eat meat. So that's what's called a healthy user bias. They're healthy in every way. So do we know that it's the meat, not eating meat, that makes them healthier or not? So basically, it's, these are the non-meat eaters, these are the meat eaters, but you can't compare these groups, and you certainly can't blame the meat for the difference in their health outcomes. Or to put it another way, this one is Gwyneth Paltrow, and this is, whether you like him or not, that's Donald Trump. That's courtesy of Zoe Harcum. Anyway, so when you're looking at associations, it's really key to know, and this used to be on the National Cancer Institute website, but their own valuation was that if you have an associational study, it's inherently weak evidence, you have to have what's called a relative risk of lower than 2. So let's just go back to that study on colorectal cancer that we were looking at before, 1.17 and 1.18, where 1 means no risk at all. These are tiny, tiny associations, and they're definitely below 2. So when anybody sends you one of those, when you get one of those studies from your helpful family member, and you just look at the relative risk, that's in nutrition epidemiology, it is almost never above the number 2. And you just highlight that for them. And then you say, it's too low, it's probably got a healthy user bias in that study, so we can't trust it, according to the National Cancer Institute. So this was by contrast, the most rigorous review that ever took place on red meat, okay? And they concluded, they looked at all the entire literature on red meat, and they said that and looking at red meat and cancer, it said the effects are very, very small, and the certainty of evidence is low to very low. Take a screenshot of that, because that is the most rigorous review that has ever been conducted on red meat and cancer. The most comprehensive and the most rigorous. It was done with the GRADE methodology that I showed you earlier, which is used by some 200 public health institutions all over the world. This group also did a couple of other reviews where they looked at different outcomes, and they had the similar conclusions. Low to very low certainty evidence, little to no effect on cardiometabolic outcomes, so that's anything related to heart disease or insulin resistance or cancer. And this one, very small association, very low certainty evidence. So it's just saying we really do not have evidence to condemn red meat. What happened with those papers? Now again, we're sort of shifting to like, what are the forces that are affecting our science and therefore our understanding of science? Well, before it was even published, this group called the True Health Initiative, led by David Katz, they wrote saying, we want you to withhold publication of it. They wanted to censor the paper before it even came out. Potentially damaging information. And it's because this group is basically, they're promoting a plant-predominant diet, and they don't want this information coming out. What happened with that is a fascinating story. You can read it in this article, but basically the editor-in-chief of this journal that published the red meat article, she said her inbox was flooded with more than 2,000 emails in a short period of time, half an hour. She said in her decade at the helm of this respected journal, the tone of the emails was particularly caustic. We've published on firearm injury prevention. The response from the NRA was less vitriolic than the response from the True Health Initiative. So just imagine, what it's like to have the intimidation that this journal editor feels, right? Does she want to publish another controversial review on red meat again? Very unlikely. So that's why our information environment, one of the reasons why our information environment is not reflecting the science. But it gets a little worse even, which is that the lead author of those red meat papers, Bradley Johnston, his reputation is completely smeared across top newspapers. So this is the Washington Post. They said he had a conflict of interest that he didn't disclose. Same thing happened. This is another article in the Washington Post. A beef industry, they said, okay, so what was that conflict of interest? It was for a different paper that he did on sugar, nothing to do with the red meat paper. And he had received some funds, it's true, from this organization for the sugar paper, nothing to do with the red meat paper. But that wasn't the end for Bradley Johnston. Walter Willett, who's the head of nutrition formerly at Harvard School of Nutrition, he went across to many conferences displaying this disinformation triangle, where he said that disinformation comes from the sensationalist media, in which he includes the Annals of Internal Medicine, which is one of the most respected journals in the scientific world. And he also calls out the evidence-based academics meant to mock them by putting them in quotes, and that's Guyed is one of the scientists on the paper, and NutriRec is the group that Bradley Johnston started. So again, who wants to hire Bradley Johnston now? And how much does he want to go out and do more studies on anything controversial, right? And more importantly, how much does any other researcher seeing this, because this is meant to send signals to everybody in the research community, how much does anybody else want to publish or look at anything that might be controversial? You can be sure that academics, especially young academics who are not secure in their careers, are not studying controversial subjects like red meat. Okay, I'm running out of time. But this, going back to the methods used by the corporate playbook, intimidate and vilify critics. Use smear tactics and intimidation. It's right there in the playbook, and we can see it playing out. All right, I think I'm going to just go quickly through the rest of these, which is, this is another paper to take a screenshot of. Saturated fats, the most authoritative review that has ever been published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, a very conservative journal. It's really important. It concludes that there's no evidence for our current caps on saturated fat. Its authors include 4 members of the what's called the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Those are the top experts that are appointed to review the science for our dietary guidelines, and they're basically saying we got it wrong. And it was selected as one of that year's most important papers by the editor-in-chief of that journal. So this is really the most important paper that exists now saying we got it wrong on saturated fats. And we were part of making that happen. The Nutrition Coalition is the group that I founded. Thank you. So butter is indeed back, but I don't have time to go through this all now, but I mean, it has not come out in our dietary guidelines because they are ignoring the evidence. These are all the studies they reviewed for our last dietary guidelines that looked at saturated fat and cardiovascular outcomes. These are all the studies that did not support, the percentage of studies that did not support the continued caps on saturated fat, and they concluded that the evidence for keeping the caps was strong. So similarly with dietary cholesterol, they reviewed it, insufficient evidence, no relationship between the dietary cholesterol you eat and the dietary cholesterol in your blood. However, reviewed again, insufficient evidence. What does our current dietary guidelines say? Your dietary should be lower in cholesterol. Same with low-fat diets. There's no more message to recommend low-fat diets. They say in 2015, what's our most recent dietary guidelines say? Keep your fat low to the range that has normally been associated in the scientific literature as a low-fat diet. So it just remains that they're just not responsive to the evidence. Even their own evidence, they are not responsive to. So I can't really go through this, but on low carbohydrate diets, they reviewed them, they buried the evidence. I wrote a column on this, so you can read this later. And then they put them in the methodology section, the results from their study, and then they buried it in the methodology section. And one of the professors said, people who are familiar with the field may complain that we gloss over the recent evidence and don't give low-carb diets the sufficient evidence that they deserve. So, and then most recently they said they could find no low-carbohydrate diet study. Remember, there were over 1,000. All right, I think I'm going to end here. I think because we're out of time, but there's so much more to say. And if you want, I've been writing this column again called Unsettled Science. Much of what I've talked about today and much of what I couldn't get to today is I've written about in that column on Substack. So I hope to all see you there. And thank you very much.